records are held by the first person to achieve something. But in this case, astronaut Eugene Cernan holds the record for being last. In December 1972, as the commander of the Apollo 17 mission, he left the last human footprint on the surface of the moon. Eugene Cernan was an astronaut during the heyday of America's human space exploration. He logged over 566 hours in space. His memoir is called The Last Man on the Moon, and he joins me from Houston, Texas. Captain Cernan, welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be with you.
Now, your book opens with the loss of the astronauts of Apollo 1, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. Why did you start with that incident?
Well, the reason I opened there is because I wanted to share to me what were probably the most important things in my life as far as the space program was concerned. That, along with the fact that these three gentlemen were very close friends of mine. Roger Chaffee was a neighbor. I thought, perhaps short of Apollo 13 and Neil's first steps on the moon, it was probably one of the most significant happenings of the entire space program.
Why was it so significant? I mean, aside from, of course, the personal loss.
We were pressured. We were pressured to not only go to the moon to do what I think most people thought was impossible, but to get it done before the end of the decade, as well as get there before the bad guy got there. So we were pushing, and yes, we had to take a lot of risk, and indeed we did all the way through the program, but we tried to manage those risks. But I think early on we got caught up into the cost and schedules kind of thing. We had to get there. We had to do it within the budget. We took some shortcuts that I think obviously proved to be some of the wrong decisions to be made at the time. And there's some things that after the accident we looked at and said, why didn't we think of that? Why didn't we understand that we were testing this spacecraft in 100% oxygen on very, very high pressures on the surface of the Earth? And we had all the answers after the accident, but I think what hurt is the fact that we didn't have them before the accident, because if we did, we probably could have prevented it.
And it turned out to have just been an electrical fire.
Well, yeah, that's what the final conclusion was, and that's probably what it was. 100% oxygen at 18 pounds per square inch is, if you clit your teeth and there's a spark, there's going to be an explosion. But, from all bad or from all tragedies does come some good. I think probably the Apollo 1 fire and the tragedy that took the lives of Gus and Ed and Roger was probably one of the pivoting or most deciding factors in the entire program, which got us to moon. Two things. Number one, we regrouped and said, hey, let's take our time and take a look at what we're doing and where we're going, because we truly do have a challenge, and we truly are exploring an environment in which none of us have ever been in before. So let's take it step by step and make sure we're covering as many bases as we can. And number two, probably as significantly important as any, is the fact that it renewed our spirit, renewed our effort, renewed our conviction. The loss of those three guys gave us the impetus, not just to do it right, but to do it at all. Apollo 1, as I say, and I look at it very sincerely, was probably the most important moment in the entire Apollo program, and it was a moment which changed our approach to getting there. And probably if we hadn't, I say this, we'll never know, if we hadn't lost three guys on the pad on Apollo 1, we might very easily or lost someone on the way to the moon, notwithstanding we almost did anyway on Apollo 13.
I want to ask you a bit about your personal history and your career. As a young man, you had decided you wanted to be a naval aviator and fly jets before you had ever even been on an airplane.
Well, I've always said that in looking back at aviation in space is a romance. And the greatest legacy left to us by the Wright brothers is not the technology, not the commercial airplanes we fly around the world on a daily basis, but it was the spirit, the inspiration to dream, the inspiration it imparted in young boys like me then and now to dream the impossible, to dream about doing things we never thought we were capable of doing or would ever be within our reach. And yes, I was just a young kid during World War II, young 8, 10, 12-year-old kid, and I'd never been on an airplane, and really got on my first airplane probably for a short ride when I was about 18, 20 years old, and yet I dreamed about flying airplanes off aircraft carriers.
When did you first become interested in space and in becoming an astronaut?
When Alan Shepard flew, we were all interested in space. I was just a young naval officer, come back from a couple aircraft carrier cruises, flying jet airplanes in the Pacific, and not qualified. I didn't meet NASA's requirements. I didn't have enough jet time. I hadn't been in the Navy long enough to go to test pilot school, and like everybody else, looked up at in admiration of Alan. And I remembered very vividly, some 10 years later, I literally stood next to that same Alan Shepard as a backup commander to Apollo 14, and at that point in time, I had to be his equal. I was the backup commander. I had to go in case he was unable. And not only did I stand there as his equal, but I had already flown twice. I'd walked in space. I'd been to the moon once, and Alan still only had a grand total of 16 minutes of space flight experience. That's why I try and tell young people, just never count yourself out. You just never know what fate has in store.
Now, did you apply to NASA?
Mimi, I did not. I went from coming back to San Diego after my second cruise to didn't know what I was going to do with my life, and the Navy offered me an opportunity to go up to postgraduate school in Monterey, Carmel, California, and I thought that was a pretty neat place. I just got married and figured a little bit more education wouldn't hurt me, and I could keep on flying, and that still was the dream. Just because I'd made those two carrier cruises and lived that initial part of the dream flying had got in my blood, and so I did. And it was after I was up there a couple of years, I got a call from the special projects of the Navy Department, say we've been screening Navy and Marine and the Air Force, the same thing, people for some 6 months, and of course NASA had been screening several thousand civilians for a period of time, and we, the Navy, wants to recommend you to NASA for further evaluation. And I, like a dummy, said, for what? And they said, for the Apollo program, and that started the ball rolling. How could you not turn down an opportunity like that? And I figured, well, maybe if I last long enough in the evaluation program, I'll get to meet an astronaut. Until my, people say, "Wow, how did you get selected?" And maybe I don't know. I still didn't have enough test pilot, enough jet time. I still hadn't gone to test pilot school. I had a good operational background, a good education, and somebody just said, maybe that guy's worth the risk. And lo and behold, 6 months later, after several interviews and a lot of testing and so forth, they picked out of those what ended up to be several thousand people, picked 14 of us, and that's when the competition really began, because all of a sudden you're in a space program, you're walking the floors, walking the halls with John Glenn and Wally Schirra and Gus Grissom and Alan and the rest of them, but you're not guaranteed that you're ever going to fly.
It was delayed several times, but you finally did get to take off. What did takeoff feel like?
We're on a Titan booster, which is an intercontinental ballistic booster, the kinds of things that take bombs to, in case we had to ring a bell to other places of the world, and it was man-rated, if you will, and changed the name to a Gemini launch vehicle, but it was a Titan intercontinental ballistic missile, and it was about 420,000 pounds of thrust, about 140 or 50 feet tall. But it was phenomenal. It left the ground pretty quickly, not nearly as quickly as the shuttle, and it was a two-stage rocket, and it was a spectacular experience. I mean, it without question, it got your attention.
And what did it feel like when you first hit zero gravity?
I've always tried to equate it so people could understand. It's like when you go over one of those country roads in your dad's old Chevrolet about 60 miles an hour, and all of a sudden you go over a bump, and then you come back down. Well, when you get into zero gravity, you go over that bump, but you stay up there. You don't come back down. All of a sudden the booster shuts down, and 150 or 200 miles above the surface of the Earth, and you're automatically in zero gravity, and your stomach sort of comes up into your throat, and all of a sudden, you stay there, and there's a few tidbits and a few old screws that they didn't get out of the spacecraft just floating around. And
so did you get sick?
Felt a little woozy for the first few hours. Yeah, I'll admit that I did. I felt a little woozy. We're strapped in. We couldn't move very much because the Gemini spacecraft didn't. Two of us in a Gemini spacecraft was probably far less room than two people in the front seat of one of those old Volkswagen Beetles. So we didn't have a lot of room. We had our spacesuits on. We couldn't take them off. We could take our helmets off and our gloves off. Had a little window about 6 or 8 inches away from our nose, and that's all we had. That is until I had an opportunity to open a hatch and take my spacewalk.
Well, let's talk about that spacewalk, because Chapter 13 of your book is titled The Spacewalk from Hell.
That's sort of what it became, and if things had been different, I might not be here talking to you about it. We didn't know much about what we were doing about spacewalking in zero gravity. Ed White on Gemini 4 had a spectacular 20-minute spacewalk. Had a little air gun he could sort of use to fly around and control his position in space. I had a much more ambitious, it was going to be 2.5, 3-hour spacewalk. Ended up to be over 2.5 hours. To first go out and check out umbilical dynamics, which all that told us was we have no business trying to walk in space or do anything out there without a capability to control our body and either something to stand on or hold on to or something to propel ourselves around space. And the latter part of that was to do just that, to go into a back of the spacecraft. Our spacecraft was so small, everything was outside, and we had what I call a Buck Rogers maneuvering unit tucked away in the back of the spacecraft outside. So I had to go out there in a pressurized spacecraft, which sort of was like a suit of plaster of Paris that was just sprayed on you, pretty difficult to move around in, and basically assemble this unit with hot rocket gases in it and strap it on and fly around. And this was 18 years before we ever eventually did it. And this was only the second time we'd ever been out of a spacecraft. And so we truly were ambitious, and I had a lot of problems holding my position. I fogged up my visor, I overpowered the environmental control system. I had very little light back there. I was going around the world at 18,000 miles an hour.
And what was the temperature out there?
Around the Earth, of course, it's different when you go to the moon, but around the Earth you go through a daytime and a nighttime every 90 minutes. So in the nighttime it can get very cool because you radiate to the deep dark space. In the daytime it gets very hot. As a matter of fact, during the day when my back was to the sun, it actually sort of scorched part of my suit. But the fact of life, I did get into space in this Buck Rogers unit. I did disconnect myself from the spacecraft, oxygen and radio, and I did become autonomous and start breathing the oxygen from this unit. And all Tom Stafford had to do was flip a switch, and I would have been out there flying like an astronaut, I guess. Our communications was bad. I was tired. My visor was still fogged, and so we had to wait for that to clear. Time was running out, and the decision was made that we would go no further. And, of course, I was disappointed because I know I could have done it. And in retrospect, it was probably the right decision to make because, every time I turned a valve would turn me back, and I'd go floating back out in space. And I truly had no way of holding myself in one place. When it would have become time to get out of that unit, it probably would have been a very difficult, if not impossible, task. And then, of course, at the end of that mission, my EVA or my spacewalk was not over till I got back in that little tiny spacecraft, which was truly became smaller as soon as you get out there and your spacesuit expands and blows up.
So you had a hard time actually getting back in.
Let me just say this without getting too wordy. It's like putting a champagne cork back into a champagne bottle, and I know most of us have all tried that.
That's astronaut Eugene Cernan. He's on the line with me from Houston, Texas. We're discussing his memoir called The Last Man on the Moon. What did you see when you stepped out of the aircraft into space?
Well, I tell you, after looking at that little window, it probably wasn't 6 by 8 in size, and I opened the hatch over Hawaii. It was still dark. We're moving through the sky across the sky at 18,000 miles an hour. It wasn't long before I saw the sun started coming up over the southwestern part of the United States, glistening off the sand and the mountaintops. And when the sun did come up, I could see from Seattle all the way down through Baja California, down the coast of Mexico, and it brilliantly clear. Of course, a few clouds, but I had effectively the whole world in front of me, and it was an unbelievable, overwhelming picture at that point in time in my life, only to be surpassed by looking at the Earth from the moon.
Well, tell us about that. What did the Earth look like from the moon?
I wish we had the rest of the day to talk about this. It's the most overwhelming, awe-inspiring viewer vision a human being can ever have. Let me just try and let it suffice to say that technology and science got me to the moon. But when I got there I was standing on a plateau somewhere in space, somewhere in this universe, on another planet, if you will, if you allow me to call the moon a planet. When you step on the moon, you are now on another body in this universe, and you stand on that plateau surrounded by blackness, not darkness, blackness, the blackness of the sky, the endlessness of it all, the infinity of time and space, and out there somewhere 250,000 miles away is the Earth, and all its splendor and all its beauty, the multicolor blues of the oceans and whites of the snow and the clouds you can see from pole to pole and ocean to ocean, and you watch the Earth rotate what I call very mysteriously, yet very majestically on an axis that you can't see, but you know it must be there. Science and technology got me there, but could not explain what I was seeing nor what I was feeling. It was something unique, something special. I don't use the word religious. I think religion is man-made. It was spiritual, certainly. It made me believe there's so many things we don't know, and that none of what I'm looking at could have ever happened by accident. There has to be somebody bigger than all of us who put this together. It could not exist. That's me talking. That's what I came home with.
You're only one of 12 humans to have ever stepped on the moon. You're the last one there. I mean, what do you do after having done that? I mean, you can never top that.
You know, I've been asked several times what it's like to make that first step on a moon. Well, it was unique and special. You know, it's a step no one can ever take away from me. But I think the most nostalgic thing for me was making that last step. I knew no one would be there for some time. I didn't believe it would be this long, but I knew not only no one would be there for some time, I knew I was not coming this way again. You know, I started to climb up the ladder, look down at my footprint down there, and I wanted to stay. We couldn't, but I wanted to stay. You know, I've equated it to sitting on God's front porch. That's where I had been for 3 days of my life. Now, after you go through the liftoff and everything it takes to get home, and you come home, you don't really get a chance to think about it. It took me 25 years before I ever could sit down and put some of those thoughts and memories on paper in the form of a book, because things happen so fast while they're going on or while you're there that you don't get a chance to relish them or think too much about them. And I even had to think, and when I wrote my book, I admitted, you know, when I came home, I started looking for other mountains to climb. I started looking for other moons, and there weren't any out there. And, you know, I kept saying, well, getting up in the morning is a challenge, and that was sort of a cop-out. And it took me a long time. Maybe it took enough time for my grandkids to grow up and for me to realize that there truly was something else of significant importance in my life, and so that's where I find myself now. I got 9 grandkids, and they truly are that. I found that next moon. I found that next big challenge in my life.
That's Eugene Cernan. The book is called The Last Man on the Moon, Astronaut Eugene Cernan and America's Race in Space. It's written with best-selling author Don Davis and published by St. Martin's Press. Captain Cernan, I want to thank you so much for being on the program. It's
been my honor and my pleasure, and it's sort of nostalgic to think about this. Thank you for giving me a lift.
Support for the Mimi Geerges Show is provided in part by United Space Alliance, the space operations company. A world leader in space operations, United Space Alliance has skills and experience in virtually every aspect of the field. From flight design and planning to crew training, flight software development, vehicle processing, and end-to-end mission operations. United Space Alliance offers innovative solutions for space operations on Earth, in orbit, and beyond. More information is at unitedspacealliance.com. And by the Coalition for Space Exploration. SpaceCoalition.com has valuable news and resources about America's space program. Innovations derived from space exploration have allowed us to not only set foot on the moon, but provided us with life-saving technologies and daily conveniences that we often take for granted. Automobile enhancements, fire protection gear, medical devices, and communication tools prove that exploration drives discovery, benefiting every American every day. The Mimi Geerges Show is independently produced and distributed by Focal Point Radio. I love hearing from our listeners, so I hope that you'll take a moment to send me your thoughts and your comments. The email address is feedback@mgshow.org. You can also go on our website, www.mgshow.org, and use our contact form. And while you're there, you can listen to audio archives of our previous shows. If you have an MP3 player, you can sign up for our podcast. And you can take a look at our new blog. Thanks for listening, everybody. I'm Mimi Geerges, and I will talk to you again next week.